They always say a girl like her should know her place. And Eliza Whitmore had learned that lesson long before she could measure 5 feet tall, in rooms colder than winter stone and quieter than prayer, where servants moved like shadows and voices like hers were never meant to be heard. Yet tonight the grand ballroom of Ravenscroft Manor burned with candlelight and laughter that did not belong to her, and still she stood there, holding a silver tray, steady despite the tremor in her fingers, as silk and jewels brushed past her like she was air, invisible, forgettable, safe in her silence until a voice, sharp, careless, cut through the music, asking why a mere maid dared to linger so close to the Duke's guests. And the laughter that followed was soft but cutting, the kind that did not need to be loud to wound. Yet Eliza did not lower her gaze the way they expected, did not rush away as she had been taught, because something inside her refused to break, even now, even here, and it was that quiet defiance that caught the attention of a man standing at the far end of the room, half hidden in shadow where the light did not quite reach. Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Ravenscroft, a man whose presence alone could silence a room, yet who had spoken nothing all evening, watching, always watching, as if the world bored him, until his eyes settled on her, not as one looks at a servant, but as one studies a question not yet answered. And though Eliza could not have known it, something in that moment shifted, subtle as breath against glass. While the noblewoman who had spoken stepped closer, her smile edged with amusement as she reached out and brushed imaginary dust from Eliza's sleeve, a gesture so delicate and yet so deliberate that the surrounding guests leaned in, hungry for the quiet cruelty of it. And still Eliza did not move, did not speak, her silence becoming its own kind of resistance, fragile yet unyielding, like a candle refusing to go out in a draught. And somewhere across the room, the Duke's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the crystal glass in his hand, his gaze sharpening, no longer distant, no longer indifferent, because for the first time that evening, something, or rather someone, had refused to disappear on command, and in a world where everything bowed, where everything obeyed, that alone was enough to make him watch her again, and this time, he did not look away. The laughter did not fade immediately, but it shifted, thinning into something uncertain, as if the room itself had taken a breath it could not quite release, and Eliza felt it before she understood it, that subtle change in the air when attention moved not away from her, but towards something far more dangerous. And though she kept her gaze lowered, she could feel it, a weight that settled across the room like a storm gathering just beyond the windows. While the noblewoman's smile faltered for the briefest second, her hand still lingering against Eliza's sleeve as if unsure whether to continue the performance or retreat with dignity. And then it came, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, the quiet sound of a glass being set down with deliberate care, echoing far louder than it should have in a hall filled with music, and every conversation seemed to loosen at its edges, every voice lowering, until the silence became impossible to ignore, and Eliza's breath caught as she finally dared to lift her eyes, not fully, not boldly, but just enough to see him moving, each step measured, unhurried, yet commanding in a way that required no announcement. The Duke crossing the length of the ballroom as if it belonged entirely to him, as if every soul within it existed only because he allowed it, and no one stopped him, no one spoke, because no one would dare, and when he reached them, he did not look at the noblewoman first, nor at the circle of watching guests, but at Eliza, directly, fully, as though she were not something beneath notice but something that demanded it, and the weight of that gaze was unlike anything she had ever known, not cruel, not mocking, but searching, unsettling in its quiet intensity, and for a moment that stretched too long, the world seemed to narrow to that single point between them, until the noblewoman cleared her throat with a soft, nervous laugh, attempting to reclaim the moment, explaining lightly that it was only a servant who had forgotten her place, nothing of consequence, nothing worth troubling his grace, and the words hung there, fragile, waiting for dismissal, for agreement, for the easy indifference that would restore order, but it did not come, because Alexander Ravenscroft did not look away from Eliza, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying across the silence with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. He asked her name, not as one might ask a servant out of idle curiosity, but as one demands truth. And the question struck her harder than any insult could have, because no one in that room had cared to know it. And for a heartbeat she could not answer. Her voice caught somewhere between fear and something far more dangerous, until she found it, soft but steady, Eliza Whitmore, and the way he repeated it, quietly, as if testing its weight, sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. Confusion replacing amusement, because this was not how such moments were meant to unfold, not in rooms like these, not under chandeliers that had witnessed generations of unspoken rules. And yet here it was, unfolding anyway, and the noblewoman's composure began to crack, her smile tightening as she attempted once more to guide the moment back to safety, suggesting that the girl be dismissed, that the evening continue without disruption. But the Duke did not move, did not turn, did not grant her the acknowledgement she sought, because his attention remained exactly where it had settled, fixed and unyielding. And when Eliza instinctively stepped back, retreating toward the safety of invisibility she had always known, it was then that his hand lifted slightly, not touching her, not restraining her, but stopping her all the same, and his next words, spoken without raising his voice, altered the shape of the night entirely. "You will remain." The command landed in the center of the ballroom like a seal pressed into hot wax, final and impossible to challenge. And for one suspended heartbeat no one moved, not the musicians, not the guests, not even the footmen stationed by the doors, because every person in the room understood that the Duke had just done what he never did. He had interrupted the natural order of his own house for the sake of a maid. And Eliza felt the eyes on her multiply, not with laughter now, but with something sharper, confusion mixed with resentment, while the noblewoman beside her gathered herself with a brittle smile and attempted one last graceful retreat, murmuring that she had only meant to keep standards in the Duke's home, only meant to preserve decorum. But Alexander Ravenscroft turned his gaze to her at last, and the warmth in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees as he replied that decorum did not include humiliating staff in front of guests, not in his house, not under his roof. And the precision of his tone was more cutting than anger could have been, because there was no emotion to argue with, no raised voice to call dramatic, only authority, clean and absolute. And the noblewoman curtsied with stiff fingers before stepping back into the crowd, her cheeks pale, while the whispers returned in low currents, spreading from one cluster of silk and jewels to the next, all of them asking the same question without daring to say it too loudly. Why her? Why this girl? Why now? And Eliza wanted nothing more than to disappear into the corridor beyond the ballroom, to return to the quiet safety of the servants' wing where names did not matter and no one watched her breathe. But the Duke had told her to remain, and she had spent her whole life obeying commands. So she stood there with the tray, still balanced in her hands, shoulders straight, pulse racing, as Alexander regarded her in silence for a long moment that made her feel both exposed and seen in equal measure. Then he took the tray from her himself, a simple act that should have meant nothing and yet sent another ripple through the room, because men like him did not take burdens from women like her. They handed them over, they dismissed, they forgot, and he did none of those things, instead placing the silver carefully on a nearby table before asking, quietly enough that only she could hear, if she had been injured by the insult. And the question startled her more than the command had, because concern was not a language she expected from men with titles, and she answered truthfully that she was not hurt, only embarrassed, to which he replied that embarrassment belonged to those who had behaved poorly, not to her. And there was no softness in his voice, no attempt at comfort, only a statement of fact delivered with such certainty that something in Eliza's chest tightened unexpectedly, as if a locked door she had forgotten was there had shifted on its hinges. But before she could make sense of it, the orchestra resumed with hesitant notes, and the ballroom exhaled, guests turning away in practiced motions, pretending not to stare while still watching from the corners of their eyes. And Alexander stepped back just enough to restore propriety, his expression unreadable once more, every trace of that singular focus hidden behind the same calm mask he wore for the world. Yet when Eliza moved to retreat at last, thinking the moment had ended, he spoke again without looking at her, his voice low and measured beneath the returning music, telling her to bring the ledger from the West Library to his study when the final dance ended, and to come alone. And though the words were simple, practical, entirely proper, they struck her with the force of a second command because they carried a promise she could not yet name, that the night was not finished, that whatever had begun in the ballroom was only the first crack in a silence that had held for far too long. The music swelled again, smoother now, as if the room itself had decided to forget what had happened. But Eliza could not, because every note seemed sharper against her skin, every movement around her slower, heavier, as though she had stepped into a different version of the same night, where nothing was quite as it had been before. And though she returned to her duties with practiced precision, carrying trays, refilling glasses, moving through the edges of the ballroom where servants were meant to exist unseen, she could feel it still, that invisible thread that had been drawn between her and the man who had spoken her name as if it mattered. And once, only once, when she dared to glance toward the far end of the room, she found him already looking, not openly, not in a way that would invite gossip, but in brief, deliberate moments that made her breath falter before she forced herself to look away again. Because nothing about this was safe, nothing about this was ordinary, and she knew better than to mistake attention for anything resembling kindness in a world where power could shift without warning. Yet the memory of his words lingered, steady and unyielding, refusing to be dismissed like everything else in her life had been, until at last the final dance was announced, and the ballroom began its slow descent into conclusion, laughter loosening, conversations turning toward departure, cloaks gathered, carriages called, and Eliza slipped away before she could be summoned, moving through the service corridor toward the West Library where the ledger he had mentioned was kept, her steps quick but controlled, because she would not run, not here, not after what had happened, and the corridor greeted her with its familiar quiet, the distant echoes of the ballroom fading behind stone walls as the scent of wax and old wood replaced perfume and candle smoke, grounding her in the world she understood, the world where she knew her place. And yet even here, in the dim light of a single lamp, she could not escape the awareness that she was no longer entirely invisible, that something had shifted in a way she could not yet name. And when she reached the library, her fingers brushed the spine of the ledger with a steadiness she did not quite feel, lifting it carefully as its weight settled into her arms, heavier than it should have been, as though it carried more than numbers and records, as though it marked the boundary between the life she had known and something uncertain beyond it. And for a moment she stood there, alone among shelves that reached toward the ceiling, considering the possibility of not going, of leaving the ledger on the desk and returning to the servants' quarters where no one would question her absence, where the night could end as all nights did, quietly, without consequence. But the thought did not hold, because he had given a command, and more than that, he had asked for her presence in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, and against her better judgment. She found herself turning toward the corridor once more, the ledger held close as she made her way toward the Duke's study, each step measured, each breath steady, until she reached the heavy door at the end of the hall, its dark wood polished to a quiet sheen. And there she paused, not out of fear, but out of something far more dangerous, anticipation, because whatever waited on the other side would not allow her to return, unchanged. And when she finally lifted her hand to knock, the door opened before her knuckles could touch the surface, as if he had been expecting her all along. The door opened without sound, and Eliza found herself standing on the threshold of a room that felt entirely different from the rest of the house, quieter, heavier, as if even the air here carried weight. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because something in the Duke's gaze held her exactly where she stood, his eyes steady on hers in a way that made retreat feel impossible before she had even taken a step inside. And then he moved aside, just enough to allow her passage, not with a gesture of dismissal but of invitation, subtle yet unmistakable, and she entered, the door closing behind her with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been, sealing the space into something private, something separate from the world beyond it, where candlelight flickered against dark wood and shelves lined with books rose toward the ceiling, their presence quiet but imposing. And she realized that this was not a room meant for display, not like the ballroom, but a place where truth might exist without witnesses, and that realization made her grip on the ledger tighten slightly as she stepped forward, offering it to him with both hands in the manner she had been taught, respectful, precise, and he took it without looking at it, his attention still fixed on her in a way that made the simple exchange feel far more significant than it should have been, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, not uncomfortable but charged, as if words would only disturb something already in motion. Until at last he set the ledger aside unopened and asked her why she had not defended herself, the question direct, without softness, and it struck her with a quiet force because it assumed she had the right to do so, something no one had ever suggested before, and she answered carefully, choosing honesty over caution, that there had been nothing to defend, that a servant's place was not argued but accepted, and the faintest shift crossed his expression, not agreement, not dismissal, but something sharper, as though her answer had revealed more than he had expected, and he stepped closer, not invading her space but narrowing the distance just enough that she became aware of it, the subtle change in air, the quiet intensity that followed him, and he told her that what had happened in the ballroom had been unacceptable, that it would not happen again under his roof, and the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. Yet it was not the words themselves that unsettled her. It was the way he said them, as if her treatment mattered in a way she did not yet understand, and she lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission but in thought, because part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that certainty, but another part, older and quieter, reminded her that nothing in her life had ever changed so easily, and perhaps he sensed that hesitation, because his next question came softer, though no less deliberate, asking how long she had been in his household, and she told him the truth, that she had arrived 3 years ago, that she had kept to her duties, that she had not caused trouble, and something in that answer seemed to hold his attention in a different way, as if the absence of notice was itself a detail worth examining, and he repeated the number under his breath, 3 years, as though testing it against the reality of her presence, and then, almost to himself, he said that he had never seen her before tonight, and the words lingered between them, not as an accusation, not as regret, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something overlooked, something missed, and Eliza felt it then, not as fear, not as relief, but as a shift so subtle it was almost imperceptible, like the first movement of something long dormant beginning to wake, and she realized, standing there in the stillness of his study, that whatever had drawn his attention to her in the ballroom had not faded with the music, it had only followed her here, into a space where it could no longer be ignored. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, softened at the edges as if the room itself was listening, waiting for something neither of them had yet decided to say, and Eliza became acutely aware of every small detail, the steady tick of a clock somewhere behind her, the faint crackle of candle wicks, the measured rhythm of the Duke's breathing as he stood just close enough to unsettle her, not with force but with presence, and she found herself holding still in a way that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with uncertainty, because nothing in her life had prepared her for this kind of attention, quiet, focused, and impossible to dismiss. And when he moved again, it was not away from her, but past her, circling slightly as though considering something from a different angle, his steps slow, deliberate, never hurried, and she felt his gaze remain on her even when she could no longer see him directly, as if distance did nothing to lessen its weight, until he spoke once more, asking what duties she performed in the household, and the question, simple as it was, grounded her enough to answer without hesitation, listing them clearly, serving in the dining hall, assisting in the East Wing, keeping accounts when required, tasks she had learned to carry out without error because precision was the only protection she had ever known, and he listened without interruption, without impatience, as though each word mattered. And when she finished, there was a brief pause before he remarked that accounts required education, more than most maids were given, and she felt a flicker of something she quickly pressed down, because explanation was a risk she had long ago learned to avoid. Yet he waited, not demanding, not pressing, simply holding the silence in place until she chose whether to fill it, and after a moment she did, quietly, telling him that her father had taught her numbers before he passed, that it had been of use, nothing more, and she expected the conversation to end there, for him to nod and dismiss it as an odd detail of no consequence. but instead he stopped moving entirely, as if the information had settled into something more significant than she intended. And when she turned slightly, uncertain, she found him watching her with a focus that felt sharper than before, as though a pattern was beginning to form where none had existed earlier. And he asked her why such a skill had gone unnoticed, why no one had thought to place her where it might be better used. And she had no answer for that, not one she could safely give, because the truth was simple and yet impossible to say aloud, that no one had looked closely enough to see it, that no one had thought it worth the effort. And so she said only that she had done what was required of her, nothing beyond. And for the first time a faint change touched his expression, not anger, not frustration, but something quieter, something that suggested he did not accept that answer as complete. And the air between them shifted again, not tense, not strained, but charged with a new kind of awareness, as though the conversation had moved beyond what was expected into something neither of them had planned. And when he stepped closer once more, stopping just within the boundary of propriety, he spoke in a tone that carried no room for dismissal, telling her that beginning tomorrow she would no longer serve in the ballroom, that she would report instead to his study for work he would assign personally. And the words settled over her with a weight she could not immediately understand, not a request, not a suggestion, but a decision already made. And instinctively she began to protest, to say that she was not suited, that others would be more appropriate. But he did not raise his voice to stop her, did not need to, because a single word, quiet and absolute, cut through her hesitation before it could fully form. No. And in that moment she understood that whatever had begun in the ballroom had now taken shape into something far more deliberate, something that would not allow her to return to the life she had known. Because the Duke had not only noticed her, he had chosen to change where she stood within his world, and he was not asking if she agreed. Eliza did not remember leaving the study, only the way the corridor felt longer than before, the candlelight dimmer, the silence heavier, as if every portrait along the walls had turned to watch her pass and mark the moment she stopped being what she had always been. And by the time she reached the servants' stairwell her hands were cold despite the warmth of the house, her thoughts moving in careful circles around the Duke's command. Because command she understood, but this was different. This was not a correction or a punishment. It was a change, and change in a house like Ravenscroft Manor was never simple, never quiet, and certainly never kind. Yet the next morning arrived with all the ordinary sounds of duty, the kitchen bells, the rustle of aprons, the clipped voices of housekeepers assigning tasks. And for a brief moment, she almost convinced herself the night before had been some strange misunderstanding, until Mrs. Grayson, the head housekeeper, called her name in a tone that carried both surprise and disapproval and informed her, in front of 2 footmen and a maid who pretended not to listen, that she was to report to the Duke's study at 8 o'clock sharp and would no longer serve in the ballroom. And the words spread through the servants' hall faster than steam from the morning tea, whispers rising and falling around her like rain against stone, some curious, some jealous, some openly suspicious, because no one in that house could imagine a reason for the Duke to summon a maid to his private study unless it was scandal or disgrace. And Eliza kept her face still, her voice steady, saying only that she would do as instructed, while inside her pulse moved too quickly for calm. And at precisely 8, she stood again before the same dark door, this time in daylight, the ledger tucked against her chest, her plain gray dress pressed and immaculate, her hair pinned with the neatness of someone trying to hold the rest of herself together. And when the butler opened the door, he did not hide his surprise at seeing her there, but he stepped aside all the same, because orders from the Duke were not questioned, and Alexander Ravenscroft stood by the window with a stack of correspondence in one hand, morning light outlining the sharp line of his shoulders, his expression unreadable as ever. Yet when he looked at her, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only recognition. And he began without preamble, assigning her to review household accounts from the East Wing, identify discrepancies in supply invoices, and prepare a summary before noon, tasks that would challenge even a trained clerk, let alone a maid. But she listened carefully, asked one clarifying question in a voice she hoped did not betray her nerves, and watched a faint shift cross his features at the sound of it, as if he had expected silence and found something else instead. And for the next 2 hours the room settled into a strange rhythm, papers turning, pen scratching, the clock marking time while she worked at the smaller desk opposite his, aware of him without looking, aware of every movement, every pause. Every moment his gaze lifted from his own documents and rested on her for a second too long, not in scrutiny now, but in assessment, as if he were measuring what she could carry and where she might break, and she refused to break, refused to falter. Because if this was a test, she would not fail in front of him, not after all those years of being unseen. And when she finally placed the finished summary on the edge of his desk, expecting correction, perhaps dismissal, he read it in silence, then looked up and said, simply, that it was accurate, and the single word of approval struck harder than praise ever could have, because it was honest, unadorned, and meant for her alone, and before she could decide what to do with that feeling, there came a sharp knock at the door, and a familiar noblewoman's voice floated in from the hall, bright with entitlement, asking to see the Duke regarding the previous evening's misunderstanding, and Eliza instinctively rose, gathering the papers to leave, retreating toward the safety of invisibility she knew so well. But Alexander did not even glance at the door when he spoke, his tone quiet and final, stopping her where she stood, telling her to sit down and continue her work, because she was not leaving. The command settled over her like a weight she could not step out from beneath, and for a moment Eliza remained standing, her fingers still lightly touching the edge of the paper she had gathered, her instinct to retreat colliding with something far less familiar, the certainty in his voice that did not allow refusal, and slowly, almost carefully, she returned to her seat, her movements precise despite the awareness pressing in from every side, because the door remained closed but not silent. The presence beyond it unmistakable, the noblewoman's voice carrying through the wood in softer tones now, coaxing, expectant, as if she had never been denied anything in her life. And Eliza felt the shift in the room before she saw it. The way Alexander's attention did not move toward the door, did not acknowledge the interruption at all, as though the world outside this study had lost its importance the moment he had told her to stay, and that realization unsettled her more than the command itself, because it placed her, however briefly, at the center of something she did not understand, and she lowered her gaze to the ledger again, forcing her focus onto the columns of numbers that had always made sense when people did not. Yet even as she worked, she could hear the quiet exchange outside, the butler's measured reply, the slight pause that suggested hesitation, and then the door opened without ceremony. The noblewoman stepping inside with practiced elegance, her expression composed, her posture flawless, though something sharper flickered beneath the surface when her eyes landed on Eliza seated at the Duke's desk, not standing, not dismissed, but working, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, layered with everything left unsaid, and Alexander did not rise to greet her, did not offer the courtesy she clearly expected, instead remaining exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair as he regarded her with the same calm indifference he had shown the ballroom, and she began to speak, her tone carefully measured, referencing the previous evening as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate lapse in judgment that she wished to resolve privately, her words smooth, practiced, designed to restore balance, to re-establish the order that had been disrupted, and Eliza kept her eyes on the page, though she could feel the weight of the woman's attention shifting toward her, assessing, calculating, as if trying to understand how someone so insignificant had come to occupy a place she did not belong. And then Alexander spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that cut through the room with absolute precision, telling her that there had been no misunderstanding, that the behavior he had witnessed was unacceptable, and that it would not be repeated, and there was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, only a statement that carried the full force of his authority, and the noblewoman's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, her smile tightening, her eyes flickering once more toward Eliza before returning to him, and she attempted again, softer now, suggesting that the presence of staff during such discussions might be inappropriate, that privacy would be more suitable, and for the first time Eliza's hand stilled against the paper, the words striking too close to the truth she had always known, that she did not belong in rooms like this, that she was meant to disappear when matters of importance were discussed, and she began to rise again, the motion automatic, familiar, But she did not make it to her feet, because Alexander's voice stopped her before she could fully move, calm and unyielding as before, telling her to remain seated. And then, without looking at her, he added that her presence was required, and the words shifted everything, not because they were loud, but because they were deliberate, because they placed her within the moment rather than outside it. And when the noblewoman fell silent, truly silent this time, there was no room left for argument, only the quiet realization that the balance of the room had already been decided, and Eliza felt it then, not as triumph, not as relief, but as something far more fragile and far more dangerous, the unmistakable awareness that she was no longer being overlooked, and that whatever protection his authority offered came with a cost she had yet to understand, because in that room, under his gaze, she was no longer invisible, and there would be no returning to what she had been before. The silence that followed did not break easily. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if any word spoken too quickly might shatter it beyond repair. And the noblewoman stood very still, her posture perfect, her expression carefully composed. Yet something had changed in the way she held herself, a stiffness that had not been there before, as though she had just realized that the rules she relied upon no longer applied within these walls. Not in this room, not under his gaze. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried less certainty, though she masked it well, offering a measured apology, not to Eliza, but to the Duke, as if acknowledging authority might restore what had been lost. And Alexander listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his attention unwavering, until she finished, and then he inclined his head slightly, not in acceptance, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement of her words as something heard and nothing more, and he told her that the matter was concluded, that there would be no further discussion, and the finality of it left no room for negotiation, no space for her to reclaim control. And for a moment she hesitated, her eyes flickering once more toward Eliza, not with open hostility, but with something far colder, calculation sharpened by wounded pride, before she gathered herself and withdrew with a controlled grace that did not quite hide the tension in her steps, the door closing softly behind her as the echo of her presence faded into the corridor, and the room exhaled again. Though the quiet that remained was not the same as before, it was heavier now, filled with the weight of what had just occurred, and Eliza found herself staring at the page before her without seeing it, the numbers blurred, her thoughts shifting too quickly to settle, because she had just witnessed something she did not fully understand, something that did not fit within the boundaries of the world she had always known, where people like her were not defended, were not acknowledged, were not placed at the center of decisions made by men like him. And slowly she became aware that he was watching her again, not with the sharp assessment from before, but with something quieter, something that lingered just beneath the surface. And she forced herself to return to her work, to steady her breathing, to anchor herself in the familiar rhythm of ink and paper, because anything else felt too uncertain to trust. And after a moment he moved, the sound of paper shifting, the faint scrape of a chair as he returned to his desk, yet the awareness between them did not fade. It settled, deeper now, as if something had been confirmed rather than questioned, and time passed in measured silence until at last he spoke again, asking if she understood what had just happened, and the question caught her off guard because it assumed she might, because it suggested that there was meaning beyond what had been said aloud, and she answered honestly that she did not, that she only knew she had been told to remain, and that she had obeyed. And a faint exhale left him, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, as though her answer had both confirmed and complicated something at once. And he rose then, moving toward the window, his gaze shifting briefly to the grounds beyond, as if considering something far larger than the room itself, before he spoke again, quieter now, telling her that people would speak of this, that they would question her presence, her position, her worth, and that she should not answer them, not defend herself, not explain, because their opinions held no weight within his house. And the words settled over her with a gravity she could not ignore, because they offered something she had never been given before, protection without condition, and yet beneath that promise lay something else, something unspoken but unmistakable, an expectation that she would remain exactly where he had placed her, within his reach, within his world. And as she stood there in the quiet aftermath, of the morning. She understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the shift take root, that whatever had begun between them was no longer a moment or a mistake. It was something deliberate, something chosen, and whether she wished it or not, she had already been drawn into it. The quiet that followed his words did not feel like an ending. It felt like the moment just before something irreversible takes shape, and Eliza stood very still, the weight of what he had said settling into her in slow, careful layers, because protection had never been offered to her without expectation, without consequence, and yet he had spoken as though it were simple, as though his word alone could redraw the line she had lived within for years, and she did not know whether to be reassured or afraid of what that meant. And so she chose the only thing she knew how to do. She nodded once, small and controlled, accepting the instruction without question, because questions would lead her somewhere she was not ready to go. And for a time the room returned to its quiet rhythm, the sound of pages turning, the steady movement of ink across paper, the distant life of the house continuing beyond the walls. Yet something had shifted too deeply to be undone by routine, and she could feel it in the way the servant's footsteps slowed outside the study door, in the way voices lowered when her name was spoken, because it was being spoken now, not with indifference, but with curiosity sharpened by uncertainty. And when at last the morning work was completed and she gathered the documents to present them, her hands were steady, her posture composed. Yet there was an awareness beneath it that had not existed before, an understanding that every action she took would now be seen differently, measured differently. And when she placed the final report before him, he reviewed it with the same quiet focus as before, though this time there was no hesitation when he set it aside, no pause before he acknowledged its accuracy. And instead of dismissing her, instead of allowing the moment to end as it should have, he remained where he was, his gaze lifting to meet hers again, and there was something in it now that had not been there the night before, not merely attention, not merely assessment, but recognition of a choice already made. And he told her that her position in the household had been formally changed, that beginning immediately she would serve as his personal clerk, responsible only to him. And the words should have felt like advancement, like opportunity, yet they carried a weight that pressed deeper than either, because they severed her from the world she understood and placed her entirely within his. Without transition, without preparation, and instinct rose again, the urge to step back, to protest, to insist that she was not suited, that such a role belonged to someone else, someone trained, someone visible. But the memory of his earlier command held her in place, and she realized with a quiet clarity that this was not a decision open to negotiation. It was a line drawn, and she had already crossed it. And as if sensing the direction of her thoughts, he spoke again, his voice low, measured, telling her that she would be provided the necessary materials, that any questions would be directed to him alone, and that no one else in the house had the authority to alter her duties. And the precision of it left no room for confusion, no space for interference. It was not simply a role, it was a boundary established around her. And as the meaning settled in, Eliza felt something shift inside her, not resistance, not acceptance, but awareness, the understanding that whatever this was, whatever he had chosen to make of her presence, it was no longer something she could quietly endure and forget, because it would follow her beyond this room, into every corridor, every whispered conversation, every glance that lingered too long. And when she finally inclined her head in acknowledgement, her voice steady as she accepted the instruction, she knew, even without looking at him, that he was watching her, not to see if she would obey, but to see if she understood. And though she did not fully, not yet, she understood enough to recognize the truth that settled between them, that she had not been placed here by accident, and that he did not intend to let her return to what she had been before. By the time she left the study, the house no longer felt like the same place. Though nothing visible had changed, the corridors remained lined with polished wood, the chandeliers burned with steady light, and the servants moved in their usual rhythm. Yet the air itself seemed to shift around her, as if every step she took carried a quiet echo of what had been decided behind that closed door, and she felt it immediately, in the way conversations softened when she passed, in the way eyes followed her just a moment longer than before, not openly, never openly, but enough that it could not be ignored. And Eliza kept her posture straight, her pace measured, refusing to give those glances anything to hold on to, because she understood instinctively that attention could be as dangerous as neglect, perhaps more so. And when she entered the servants' hall, the change became undeniable. The usual hum of conversation faltering just slightly before resuming with forced normalcy, as though nothing were different, though everything clearly was. And Mrs. Grayson looked at her with a careful expression, one that balanced authority with something almost like caution, informing her that her previous duties had been reassigned and that new instructions would come directly from the Duke. Her tone precise, controlled, but beneath it there was something else, something unspoken that suggested this was not a situation she fully approved of yet could not challenge, and Eliza inclined her head, accepting the information without comment, because there was nothing she could say that would not deepen the scrutiny already surrounding her. And so she moved through the day as instructed, returning to the study when called, completing tasks with the same quiet precision that had always defined her. Yet each action now carried a different weight, because she was no longer one of many, no longer part of the background that blended into the walls. She was singular, noticeable, and that distinction followed her into every room, every hallway, every moment where she could feel the shift in how she was perceived, and it did not go unnoticed by him, because as the hours passed and the light outside the windows softened into late afternoon, Alexander observed not just her work, but the way she carried herself within the change he had created, the way she did not falter, did not seek attention, did not attempt to use the position he had given her for anything beyond what was required, and that, more than anything else, held his interest, because it confirmed something he had begun to understand, that what set her apart was not merely what she could do, but what she refused to become. And as the evening approached and the house settled into a quieter rhythm, he dismissed her later than necessary. Watching the moment she gathered her papers, the way she paused just slightly before leaving, as though aware that each departure now carried the possibility of being called back, and when she reached the door, his voice stopped her once more, not with command this time, but with something quieter, more deliberate, asking her if she found the new position difficult, and the question lingered in the space between them, unexpected in its tone, because it suggested consideration, and she answered honestly that it was unfamiliar, but that she would learn, and he studied her for a moment, as if weighing that response against something unspoken, before telling her that unfamiliar did not mean impossible, and that she would not fail unless she chose to. And the words settled with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. And as she stepped out into the dim corridor once more, the door closing softly behind her, she realized that whatever this was, whatever had begun in that ballroom and taken shape within his study, it was no longer something that could be undone by silence or distance, because he had not only changed where she stood within his house, he had begun to reshape how she saw herself within it. And that was a far more dangerous thing than anything the Whispers could ever become. That night did not settle into quiet the way nights usually did at Ravenscroft Manor, because something unseen had already begun to ripple through its walls, carried not by words spoken aloud, but by glances, by pauses, by the subtle shift in how space was occupied when Eliza entered a room, and she felt it even in the solitude of her small chamber, where the candle burned low and steady, and the familiar simplicity of her surroundings should have brought comfort. Yet her thoughts refused to return to their usual order, circling instead around the same unspoken truth, that the Duke had not merely given her a role. He had placed her within his reach in a way that could not be undone by distance or time. And as the hours passed, and sleep came slowly, fragmented by the quiet replay of his voice, his commands, his attention, she understood that whatever protection he offered was bound to something deeper, something that had not yet revealed its full shape. And when morning arrived, pale light stretching across the stone floors, the house was already awake with the low rhythm of routine, yet beneath it ran that same current of awareness, stronger now, sharper, because the change was no longer new, it was becoming real, and Eliza moved through it with the same quiet composure she had always carried, though now it felt less like invisibility and more like control, a deliberate choice not to react, not to invite the scrutiny that followed her. And when she entered the study once more, she found Alexander already there, not at his desk, but standing by the long table covered in documents, his sleeves rolled slightly, his attention fixed on something that required more than routine review, and he did not look up immediately when she arrived, as though her presence no longer needed acknowledgement to be recognized, as though it had already become part of the space itself. And when he did speak, it was without preamble, assigning her a more complex task, one that required judgment rather than repetition, asking her to compare trade records from two separate estates and identify inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed for months. And the request carried a quiet weight, because it was not something given lightly, not something entrusted without reason, and she stepped forward, her focus settling quickly despite the lingering awareness of everything else, because this, at least, was something she could hold on to, something that did not shift beneath her feet. And as she worked, the silence between them deepened, no longer uncertain but established, a rhythm that did not require constant attention yet never fully released it. And at one point she paused, just briefly, as a pattern began to form within the numbers, something subtle but undeniable, and without thinking she spoke, pointing out the discrepancy, explaining the connection she saw. And the moment the words left her, she became aware of what she had done, that she had spoken without being asked, without waiting for permission. An instinct told her to step back, to apologize, to correct the breach. But before she could, Alexander moved closer, his attention shifting fully to the documents, his focus sharpening in a way that made it clear he had not only heard her, he was considering what she had said, and the silence that followed was not disapproval, it was evaluation. And when he finally spoke, it was not to correct her, not to remind her of her place, but to confirm that she was right, that the inconsistency indicated something deliberate rather than accidental, and the weight of that acknowledgement settled differently than before, deeper, because it was not merely approval, it was trust, and she felt it in the way he did not reclaim the papers immediately, in the way he allowed her to continue, to follow the line of thought she had uncovered, as though her judgment held value equal to the task itself. And for a moment the world narrowed. Again, not to the tension of the ballroom, not to the uncertainty of the previous day, but to something quieter, something far more dangerous, the realization that she was no longer simply fulfilling a role he had given her. She was becoming part of the decisions he made, and as that understanding settled in, she did not look at him, did not allow herself to, because she knew without seeing that he was watching her, not to control, not to command, but to witness what she would become now that she had been seen. The realization did not arrive like a sudden revelation, it unfolded slowly, quietly, in the space between numbers and silence, in the steady rhythm of thought that no longer belonged entirely to the life Eliza had once known. And as the morning stretched into afternoon, the study became something more than a room of work. It became a place where boundaries shifted without announcement, where the distance between them no longer felt fixed, and though she remained at her desk, her focus sharp, her movements precise, there was an awareness beneath it all that could not be set aside, because every decision she made now carried weight beyond the task itself, and she felt it in the way Alexander did not interrupt, did not correct, did not reclaim control of the work she had begun, as though he had already decided that her place here was not temporary, not conditional, but something he intended to define fully. And when she finished tracing the discrepancy through the records, her conclusion clear, her reasoning steady, she placed the documents before him without hesitation, no longer waiting for permission to speak, only for acknowledgement, and he read them in silence, his expression unchanged, yet something in the stillness suggested a shift deeper than approval, something closer to certainty. And when he finally looked up, there was no question in his gaze, only recognition, and he told her that she would prepare a full report for the estate council, that she would present it under his authority, and the words settled with a quiet force that altered the shape of everything that had come before, because this was no longer confined to the study, no longer contained within the walls of his private decisions. It would be seen, heard, questioned by those who believed they understood the order of his world. An instinct stirred again, the awareness of what that would mean, the scrutiny, the doubt, the resistance that would follow. And for a moment she hesitated, not in fear, but in understanding, because stepping into that space would mean there was no returning to what she had been, no retreat into invisibility. And he saw it, the brief pause, the quiet calculation behind her stillness. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the force of command, only something steadier, more deliberate, telling her that she would not stand alone when she did it, that his word would stand with hers. And the certainty in that promise did not remove the weight of what was coming, but it changed its nature, shifting it from something imposed into something shared. And she inclined her head once more, not in submission, but in acceptance of what had already begun to take shape between them, because she understood now, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize the truth that had been unfolding from the moment he spoke her name, that he had not chosen her out of impulse or convenience. He had chosen her because he had seen something no one else had cared to see, and having seen it, he would not allow it to be dismissed, not by others, not by circumstance, not even by her own hesitation. And as the afternoon light faded into evening, casting long shadows across the study floor, Eliza gathered the papers once more, her hands steady, her posture unchanged. Yet something within her had shifted beyond return, because she was no longer standing at the edge of his world. She was within it, and the quiet truth settled between them without need for words, that whatever path had begun in that single moment of defiance would not end with a simple choice, because he had already made his, and he did not intend to let her walk away from it. And somewhere beyond the walls of the study, the house continued as it always had, unaware that within one quiet room, two lives had already begun to change in ways neither of them could fully undo.